again, welcome, good afternoon. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished speakers, panelists, excellencies, and participants to the Web Economic Forum. Now we are going to start a round panel, I think, because it is dealing with a topic that is really hot this period of time, both due to potential risks due to the creation of fake news in different fields, let's say financial field, but even much more on the political side, and even, let's say, bordering cyber warfare in order to, let's say, create propaganda and other, let's say, drawbacks or bad effects. I will not use too much time, and I will now let our distinguished panelists introduce themselves. We have now 3 panelists this time, and we'll try to take advantage to have some more minutes because of the last one. And please, now, Stefan, is your turn to introduce yourself.
Okay, hi everyone. Staffan Trivet, I'm the CTO and co-founder of Recorded Future. I've spent sort of the last 25 years in the borderland between research and startups as a serial, sometimes parallel entrepreneur. Actually, last 10 years now I've been working at Recorded Future. So what our ambition when we started, which I think we're sort of close to fulfilling now, is to be the world's largest non-governmental threat intelligence collector. So we built a machinery for collecting everything from open source intelligence all the way down to grabbing information from underground Russian hacker forums, technical information about traffic crossing the North Korean border, stuff like that. Really with the ambition to provide us as complete a picture as possible of what threats are out there. And of course, when you're collecting all that information, of course, what you collect is both sort of correct news and fake news. So we're extremely interested, of course, in classifying different kinds of news sources and the information we get from them. So we'll come back to that later.
Thank you. Now is Jackie, please.
Good afternoon. I'm Dr. Jackie Taylor. I'm CEO and co-founder of Flying Binary. We're a web science company that changes the world with data and technology. I'm an aerospace engineer by background. I actually took a legal action to take our education regulator to court as a result of the fundamental web science that I was investigating, which is the impact of the changing models we need for our younger generation. When Sir Tim Berners-Lee discovered my work, I'm one of his international web scientists, and I'm a co-founder of the data journalism industry, so I probably am poacher and gamekeeper in this particular debate. But we have 34 million citizens that inform our web science research via our web observatory. And as one of the top 10 global IoT innovators, what I always say is the Internet of Things is an engineering challenge, true. Both the co-founders of Flying Binary are engineers, but it's a societal impact. And so some of the challenges we've already heard today are as a result of that. My focus has recently shifted from that Generation Z, the 1993 generation, and who we expect to influence 40% of the economic power by 2020, to Generation Alpha. They're our young citizens between the ages of 5 and 15, and it's our new focus. I'm delighted to be here. Thanks for inviting me, Val, in a sunny Davos.
Thank you. Pavan, please.
Hi, good afternoon. I am Pavan Dugal. I am an attorney in the Supreme Court of India, specializing in cyber law and cybersecurity. I'm currently chairing the International Commission on Cybersecurity Law, which is looking at common legal principles to govern the regulation of cybersecurity at global and national levels. I have been the president of cyberlaws.net and Cyberlaw Asia. I've been working on the intersection of law and technology since the mid-90s, and of late I've been doing a lot of work on artificial intelligence, legalities. I'm heading the Artificial Intelligence Law Hub and the Blockchain Law Epicenter. I've written more than 102 books over the last 25 years on various issues of cyber law. I done a course on Udemy on cybersecurity law, which has about 9,800 students from 157 countries. And I'm right now also the conference director of the International Conference on Cyber Law, Cybercrime and Cybersecurity, which is the world's only unique conference that looks at the intersection of these 3 fields. We had that in November last year. We had 180 speakers And we had people from 81 countries in 54 sessions over 3 days. And this year conference takes place in November. So basically, as a student of cyber law, trying to learn more how law has to adapt to these emerging technology challenges.
Okay, thank you very much for the introduction. Okay, I will say a few words about me. I'm Frodo Ronchi. I am professor at Politecnico di Milano, and we will find on the document I am Secretary General of a foundation that is called EC Misuse, European Commission Misuse Framework. But here I'm much more with the hat of the chair of the JRC on safety and security. That is kind of international structure that is working in the field of our topic of interest. So let's break the ice about a key topic of fake news and the different kind of potential fake news, the way to identify them or to, let's say, mitigate their own effects. Please, Stefan, tell us something about your research in this field.
Yes, as I mentioned, we do threat intelligence, which means that we have, sort of almost unlimited amount of data. So I think one distinction I like to make, I think, in one way, fighting fake news is a doomed fight. I think it's in many ways more interesting to actually go, look at the underlying influence operations and try to sort of identify the actors behind this and what they're striving to do. As a good example, we're also seeing over the last couple of years that the influencers or the guys behind these operations have actually, because I think of all the sort of excitement about fake news, they've actually shifted how they work. I have a couple of good examples. If we compare the 2016 presidential elections in the US with the 2018 midterms, we actually saw a shift. So in 2016, there were a lot of fake news being spread and used as part of the campaigns. Whereas in 2018, there was actually a shift to what we like to call more hyper-partisan news. So it's actually not fake, it's correct news, but it's correct news with sort of an extreme polarized perspective on things, serving for pushing a certain message. So that way, I think the actors are actually trying to sort of, get away from the accusations about spreading fake news. We've seen another campaign over the last 6-7 months taking place targeted at the UK. What we've seen here is that there's been a Twitter campaign, dozens of accounts who've been spreading news about terror attacks. And these have all been genuine attacks. The thing is that they are old attacks, but they're sort of being re-sent. So essentially, they're talking about the attacks. They're sending links to genuine, real news sources, which are, maybe 3 to 10 years old. But still, for the sort of quick reader, it still gives the impression that there are new attacks happening. So again, we see this as an attempt to actually, keep the fear level up. Again, of course, to drive some purpose. So because of these kinds of methods, we think it's becoming even more important to actually try to find the underlying operations and the actors doing it. So what we focus a lot on now is actually developing tools and methodologies to be able to identify both operations and the actors behind them. So we're doing that based on, first of all, identifying the networks of accounts and then applying different kinds of behavioral analytics to those accounts. For example, looking at which times of day, which days of the week are they working. It's a great indicator, if people don't work by participating in the campaigns on Saturdays, Sundays, or Fridays, gives you an indication of, potentially in which culture or where in the world they live. Same things, many of these people do this for a living, so they have office hours. The office hours they keep, also gives an indication on where of the globe they are actually located. So it's actually, to some extent, surprising how much you can learn just by things like that. You can also look at the publication patterns. Are they, for example, in some campaigns, we've seen that there are clearly dozens of accounts controlled by the same machinery on the back because they're actually publishing essentially the same news within the same millisecond, actually. So there are lots of tools you can apply to do these things. So I think I like to say that, of course, we eventually want to be able to certify correct news. We want to fight bad news. But I think equally important, we need to develop the tools for identifying these underlying operations. And if you look at it, some of these campaigns, like the UK one I mentioned, Twitter is clearly going after these kinds of campaigns, but when we last looked a couple of days ago, only half of the accounts were actually shut down by Twitter because they, as you all know, they have a manual process. Someone has to report an account as violating the terms of service, and then they make a manual decision to shut it down. And that's the reason the bad guys are always one step ahead here, that we don't have enough either policies or tools for actually identifying them and keeping pace. We saw that a couple of years ago when a lot of armchair jihadists in the UK were supporting ISIS. Same thing there. They had a great process for actually, when they were shut down, to turn on a new account and then have their followers move over to the new account. And again, the good side was always one step behind. So I think there's a lot of investment needed here, both in terms of methods, but also in terms of how you define the terms of service for these kinds of social networks. Thank you.
May I add something, just an additional question to you? Do you make such kind of analysis mainly based on text, or do you consider even other media? Because, of course, fake news may even involve pictures, video clips. So nowadays, with all the technological tools, you can create something very close to the movie Walking a Dog. So,
good point. I mean, and so we are actually focusing on text analytics in what we do. We do, of course, do simple things like fingerprinting images. That was actually a good example. There was a campaign this summer, in sort of the months before we had our elections in Sweden, when there were campaigns talking about how some Islam groups were crushing crosses in the streets, complaining about, that there were too many Protestants in Sweden, as they claimed. And in that case, they were actually using pictures as evidence of that. We actually, just by simple fingerprinting of those images, could trace them back to a student protest which took place in Chile 6 years earlier. In that case, we could actually, so those were not fake pictures. Again, and I think this is a theme. Of course, there are ways of producing fake images, but I think, they don't even need to do that. There are so many images out there, so you can just find some image which sort of, aligns with your message and reuse that. And then it's going to be even worse once they start moving over to tools for producing fake images and videos.
Yes, but sometimes due to the human factor, someone looks at the image and says, oh, what a bad situation.
Exactly. I mean, it's and I think this is, we heard in the last panel, Rob, I think, also said something about, when the bad guys are starting to use AI in different ways. I think it's the same thing here. The one reason they don't do that so far is they don't need to, because, they get along well with the tools they're using right now.
Okay, thank you very much at the moment. So please, Jackie.
So you'd expect me as a co-founder of the data journalism industry to support press freedom, and I want to focus a little bit on what the World Economic Forum released yesterday around the fact that they treat the whole debate around facts are sacred, and that was one of the founding pieces of the industry. And freedom of press is vitally important, and having had part of the response that we come to this in the like of exposés and understandings and investigative journalism down particular things. But the threats we've described here today on our panels need a broader perspective. Tim Berners-Lee founded Web Science. He invented the name, if you haven't heard of it, because actually multidisciplinary is the only way forward, and the Internet of Things is an engineering challenge. So it's a societal change. And the trust in news for the WEF report from yesterday was, the response from citizens was, the news I read, I trust, which is very interesting in terms of bias that might be in there. If I'm actually getting news via search, I trust 34% of it. So if I'm selecting the news, I trust 51%. If I trust in the search piece of it, I trust it 34%. In social, and this is recent research from WEF, I trust it 23%. So we're seeing that decline in trust, and trust has been mentioned on a couple of panels, and I think that's really important. Our focus at Flying Binary, though, is our future workforce, because this is a paradigm change across many sectors, and actually our young people are very skilled. One of the points I want to make in this fake news piece is, though, that platforms and the services that Generation Z, our 1993 generation and younger, use, they're actually different, the way in which they use them, what they use. And actually the key to that for this generation is their emotional intelligence response to what they see in fake news and misinformation, which is more what they call it, is actually a different response too. And so in a sense, the social movements that we see across our social web actually have been based in the way Generation Z, not Generation Y, our millennials, or Generation X that I belong to, and the way the use of the web is changing. And that's obviously as Gen Y dominate the web, as Gen Z, as I say, they're influencing 40% of the economic power by our calculations next year. And so what we've discovered in the work that we've done with the young people that we reach out to and ask our wicked questions of is communities which found social movements actually can help us defeat some of the threats that we talk about. And it's very interesting on the last panel in terms of talking about that, how are we influencing and leveraging those. So I was an independent ministerial advisor in the Cabinet Office to Lord Maud, and he originally asked the question of what this new societal change would bring. And I was part of the team that put together the Open Government Partnership, the original G8 piece, where he took to Washington and founded a new transparency agenda. And I took it very seriously when Norma challenged me on that last night as we were eating dinner of, yeah, actually, it's largely your fault then being one of the architects. And I hold my hands up and say, we had a new vision, we knew what we were trying to achieve, and yes, that has been used as a threat against us, but absolutely be assured that we've learned some very valuable lessons that the hostiles have no idea we've learned. And so we've built a new foundation for Flying Binary. We've based it on European law and regulation. So Pavan, you'll be pleased about that, or partly. But the Internet of Things is going to move too fast for that to keep pace. And so we've actually said, and a nod here to Andrea, ethics needs to play a stronger role. Not saying we're going to do that, but again, what you said on the previous panel, it's really important we understand the ethics of the multi-stakeholder piece we're doing. And I've actually just finished a trip back from Russia where I've built international consensus around the privacy by design principles that the European regulation put together, and a security-minded set of principles, not laws, not regulation, but principles. But when you get 10 regions in Russia signing up, when Iran signs up, when China signs up, I'm a strategic advisor to the Beijing government, you actually are looking at delivering citizen services in a new style democracy. The way in which we've chosen to do that as a company is smart cities. They're natural hubs of democracy. They're the focus of the UN's 2050 plan, some of the very big pieces that we need to do. But we've got our artificial emotional intelligence service that lifts and shifts that. So using the fact that Generation Z, the way they pattern on the web, the way that they engage with news, to challenge the assumptions that are being made on fake news and challenge it from a secured services point of view, and being able to look at the way in which our future workforce looks at that. So we know how to correctly interpret the signal in the noise on the web. And to take your point, text was a long time ago for us. Generation Z are a kinesthetic generation. Gen Y taught us how to do image, but Gen Z, if it's not video, they just don't care. So for us, it's video dominant. We do text, because sometimes, you know, that tells you something. But the reality is that we've actually taken a new approach. And our Cabinet Office did a press release about an hour ago to actually talk about the new intervention that we're going to do. So I'm delighted and proud to announce that the UK, as part of its outreach post-Brexit, there I've said that word, will be a new global digital marketplace based on the secured and accredited procurement controls and models that we've put there, a new capability to defeat these issues. It's a partnership approach between the nations, and it's based on that European foundation of legislation and regulation. And I will make sure that on Twitter, with the hashtags of this event, I will make that URL available. And if you're connected with me on LinkedIn, you've already got the URL. As soon as Cabinet Office made it available, I've connected it and shared it out there. And I do want to recognise the UK Cabinet Office. I'm very sorry, folks, you're not here today, but hopefully I did the announcement proud, and I look forward to working on this new initiative across our nations.
Thank you, Jackie. Yes, of course, nowadays we have the chance to compare different standpoints regarding the news thanks to the internet. Let's say the drawback is that quite a lot of different tools will try to guide you within the same approach. So when you use YouTube, then they suggest some other videos very close to the same position. And not always you use news aggregators in order to have a wide range of different standpoints on the news. And this sometimes is something to be considered in terms of young generations or users that are very happy to think that all the people is thinking in the same way, even if they follow a fake news. But now it would be relevant to know on the legal point of view how to fight against, how to be protected, how to manage. Please, at global level.
Thank you, Alfredo. Quick question to all of you here. How many of you are on WhatsApp? Please raise your hands. Majority. So yesterday has not been a good day or a good day depending on which side of the spectrum you are. WhatsApp has replicated the Indian experiment at a global level and said your forwards are now being limited to just 5. Why? Because they want to see this as a way of curbing fake news. Well, India has been seeing some remarkable work by ingenious minds who are generating fake news. Last year, in 2018, we had 33 people dying in India because of lynching by crowds on the basis of fake rumors that were circulated on WhatsApp. Now, the government has been asking information, and the information has not been coming forth. So, now the Indian government is saying, okay, we are now going to come up with the new rules and regulations which will force you to give information about the generators of those fake news to the governments. Well, if I look at holistically speaking, I find the Oxford survey bang on target. The Oxford survey has predicted that the year 2019, India is going to see a fake news epidemic. This is a classical year. We have the biggest democracy in the world, having the biggest elections, and no wonder fake news is going to be coming up. So the question arises, how do we regulate them? I take you to November 2018, and a Chinese news agency has launched the world's first artificial intelligence newscaster. It's a robo, but it looks like human, talks like human, gives you the news on the video, but more significantly, while it's giving the news, is simultaneously processing news at neck-breaking speed and is going ahead and presenting the same to you. Imagine the scenario if fake news gets disseminated by artificial intelligence or by these bots. Who is going to determine what's there? Now, since the majority of you have raised your hands as being WhatsApp users, my next question to all your users, how many of you have never forwarded a good morning to anyone else? Well, I just see 1, 2, about 4 or 5 hands who have not forwarded. A majority of us have willingly or unwillingly, knowingly or unknowingly, forwarded these good morning messages. A number of these good morning messages have malware behind the same. In a country, there's a cottage industry whose only job is to create those malwares and good mornings so that the same can be disseminated. So the bigger question, is a good morning having a malware, a fake news? Is it information reliable or is it misinformation? Now, when I take you to Malaysia, the issue became even more hotter last year. Well, Malaysia was one of the first nations in the world which came up with a dedicated fake news law in the first quarter of 2018. And then in less than 60 days, they came up with the first conviction under their fake news law. And the conviction was on the basis of the fact that someone had put up on social media a comment that a fire brigade had arrived 10 minutes late at the scene, whereas the official explanation was that it was not 10 minutes, but a couple of minutes earlier. So is a misrepresentation or an estimation of your timing tantamounting to fake news? That brings us to fundamental questions. How do we determine fake news? How do we define that? Is necessarily a fakeness a part of the news in order to qualify as fake news? Can it be not misrepresentation? Can it not be ignorance? Can it not be inadvertence? So can it not be political inconvenience or otherwise? So the entire issue of fake news is throwing up some remarkable legal policy and regulatory issues. The issues of which country determines and defines as to what is fake news. And I think these definitions that are coming up are very interesting. First and foremost, at the international level, there's no one international law on fake news. Leave aside that, there is no one international cyber law in place which will regulate the roles and duties of state and non-state actors on cyberspace. So consequently, it's all left to local national governments to come up with national laws. And we now find distinctive new approaches on what constitutes fake news. Well, when I look at the definition of fake news given by Malaysia in the Malaysian law, I find it's from a common man's perspective, it's pretty comprehensive, but the problem is it's so broad, anything which is not necessarily fake news could still be brought within the ambit of the interpretation of fake news. So one of the major challenges that critics are actually identifying is the potentiality of misuse of fake news legislation for silencing critics or for going ahead and misusing the same provisions. You look at the French law that got passed in the last quarter of 2018. Well, the government has been successful in getting the law, but which gives immense powers to the court to direct the removal of fake news, but in matters pertaining to elections. The question is, critics are saying, is it not a violation of people's fundamental right to freedom of speech and expression? And if it is so, how do we balance the same? Is fake news an exception to reasonable right to freedom of speech and expression? Those are fundamental questions that no one country has come up with a golden answer. But interestingly, I take you to Australia, and I take you in December 2018. And Australia has interestingly now come up with an anti-encryption law. The anti-encryption law, which has come into force in Australia, says that once the government mandates you to give the backdoors or give your keys to any encryption-based technologies, you are mandated to do so. And if you don't do that, that becomes an offense, punishable with imprisonment and fine. A lot of pushbacks, but nonetheless the law is still existing. The issue is, can these anti-encryption laws be used to fight fake news? More so, when the disseminators of fake news often want to hide behind the cloak of anonymity on the internet. Interestingly, a lot of fake news is getting generated from the darknet, primarily because the users have understood that the governments of the world and the law enforcement agencies are currently inadequately ill-equipped to deal ahead with the challenges of breaking through the anonymity veil provided by the darknet. So the bigger question, how do we attribute fake news to some state or non-state actor? The attribution rules are not very clear. So at best, it's governments going to go ahead and requesting service providers. Now, here, I think the role of intermediaries and service providers becomes crucial. Gone are the days of even a decade back where those guys were less powerful. Today, the data repositories of the world control the data economy. That being so, getting them to disclose information about the origin, dissemination, or publication of fake news becomes a challenge. A majority of them are located in the US, and for countries outside the US, trying to get information from these service providers regarding the origin of fake news or dissemination of fake news becomes a big challenge. Most of the time, any even prosecutions that are lodged under national laws often reach a dead end because the information is, not forthcoming, but more significantly, even the mutual legal assistance treaties have not been very effective in the context of fake news. So as I go forward, I believe this is a very fascinating time. And I want to now highlight another important trend that I'm seeing on the landscape. And this new trend has got to do with cybersecurity law. You will say, cybersecurity law and fake news, what's the relationship? I think countries have quietly figured it out that one of the best ways of trying to regulate fake news is to try to come up with legal provisions in the national laws which deal with protection and preservation of cybersecurity. So let's take the 3 cybersecurity laws that China has passed in the last 2.5 years, right from its National Security Law of 2016 to its Cybersecurity Law of 1st June 2017 to its Internet Mitigation Measures of 1st January 2018. When I read them collectively, I get absolute clarity that these three legislations can be extensively used for the purposes of identifying fake news, for the purposes of forcing service providers to give information. The issue comes now of enforcement. For a country like China, it's easier because there the system works in a particular manner. But for a number of other countries, getting, first of all, passage of laws is a challenge. Number two, a majority of countries have not yet come up with dedicated national laws on cybersecurity. But when I look at the laws in Egypt, when I look at the cybersecurity law of Singapore, and when I look at the way how a small country like Vietnam has come up with a dedicated cybersecurity law, there is absolute clarity that I think increasingly the governments will start using cybersecurity legislations as a mechanism of trying to regulate fake news. Whether they will be successful or not is a question that only future will be able to answer. But increasingly, by documenting the roles, duties, and responsibilities of data intermediaries and service providers, that can be a good way going forward. But more significantly, apart from law, we need to do far more. Law is invariably 10 steps behind technology, and expecting law to be the all solution for trying to find out the origin, dissemination of fake news, or even for enforcing information reliability is a moot point. The bigger issue is trying to create far more awareness amongst the users. Therefore, capacity building has to be intrinsically be made a part of the school curriculum from the first standard onwards. Why? Because we have started giving devices to children at very, very small ages. At the time when they have not yet been able to comprehend the kind of damage that this information can cause to them, their presence and their future, I think it's time to create far more strengthening in terms of making people more aware about these issues. But all said and done, the war has just begun. A lot of action is required to be done. Hopefully, we should see some more cogent, effective mechanisms of trying to fight fake news and ensure that the reliability of information is appropriately preserved for not just our generation, but for the future generation as well. Thanks.
And then, I think that Stefan has something to comment on.
Yeah, I wanted to comment
this.
two things actually. I mean, first of all, I think one thing worth noting is that some of the governments you mentioned are not only after regulating fake news, they're after regulating news, period, right? It's just a separate concern. One other thing which I think is interesting that we're seeing is that some of the big social media companies like Facebook, what they have, with good intentions, they've tried to improve the personal integrity of people by changing their terms of service and so on. But the side effect of that has actually been that it's harder for independent monitoring companies to see if there are campaigns going on. So I think the Facebook scandals and other things have actually driven them to a point where it's become even easier for someone to launch and maintain a fake campaign on some of those platforms.
Completely agree with you, because at the end of the day, the companies are here for making money, not for monitoring, not for identifying what is fake news. And therefore, governments will have to increasingly start coming in. Till such time the governments don't come in, the individual's behavior will have to be more strengthened.
I think the taxonomy about news and the idea to find out which is the border in between news, let's say a little bit the former news, and then fake news is very relevant even for the freedom of speech or potential control, because many times newspapers and television used to put very effective titles that do not correspond to the reality or just an idea about the future development of something. And of course, such kind of regulations, if they will be integrated in cybersecurity, may create some troubles to the freedom of speech. But I would like to ask to Jackie the opinion about the specific topic, the one described by both Pavan and Stefan.
Well, for me, the platforms where all the fuss is are not the ones that matter, because our Generation Z are not on them. And they are a millennial issue. And as we see the rise of the change in the way the social web's being used by the different generations, actually that's causing its own confusion. So what I did, and knowing that this question would come up, is I went ahead. The way we work with our secured and accredited services for the the European Council, is that we work in partnership with others that have capability in order to bring that across to member states. So we're in partnership with the Reread Corporation. We have Bob in the audience, and I'm hoping the team are on live stream. If they are, hi. And what we did was we asked a series of what we call our wicked questions. In our cyber world, stuff that is the unknown unknowns we can never get an answer to. 40,000 Gen Z across the world responded, which is actually, they must have been busy that day, that's quite low. But anyway, they did respond. But the two things that signal that future, one of the things was about the Internet of Things specifically. Do you think robots will improve lives or replace jobs? Most of the world, between 50 and 70% of the Gen Z that answered, with some notable exceptions in Germany, and we can discuss why that is if you like, said 50 to 70%, yes, it'll improve lives, it will not replace jobs. Germany was 30 to 50%, but that was an outlier. And then contrast that with, we specifically asked about IoT that those people, those young people, are interested in, because certainly in the UK, only 90% of our young people get driver's licenses now. They're not interested in that. They're interested in that whole transport economy that isn't yet there. So would you feel safe in an autonomous driverless vehicle? And basically overall, no, 47% said no, unsafe. 28% said undecided. And in further probing, that's because it's not mature enough and you're all arguing about it. But actually, 25% of that generation said, yes, we'd feel safe. That was a surprise to me. Yes, we believe that internet freedom, 87% of our Gen Z believe internet freedom and an internet right to the internet is a basic freedom, and the idea that that technology is not acceptable. And so but the other interesting thing about this whole debate is that I have never seen before is that when we reached out and we asked those 40,000 young people, number one, the millennials joined in. Not usually the case. We ask a resonant question to Generation Z, they answer us and they give us a completely different view. But 25 to 35 joined in and concurred with that view. We'll do some more work. We don't know why. But why was it important that I tell you that? Because the people that reached out, the majority of the residents was with our young men, the same young men that are being radicalized, the same young men that we've discussed today in terms of the cyber threat we face. So actually, what do I conclude about that? We need to be able to engage with them and be part of a social movement and include them as our community. But they don't subscribe to this fake news thing at all. They have no fear around it because they know they're part of that solution. And they'll navigate that themselves if we don't include them as part of our cyber world. And I plan to make available some of the detailed outputs. I've got detailed outputs from the Web Intelligence Service that we have for Europe to show you as part of the recommendations of this conference. So that's my answer. I actually disagree with you both because I'm informed by 40,000 young people. We're all wrong. So there we go.
On the basis of this disagreement, I will leave each of the speakers have 60 seconds to draw the conclusions. 40 seconds. Please.
If we don't negotiate, we'll have more time.
This is already start?
Well, I think conclusions, fake news is not going away. Number two, governments have to play an important role. Number three, service providers cannot be spectators. They will have to be active contributors in trying to sanitize content at least once it's notified. Proactive monitoring is not possible, but once notified, they should be under a time limit of 2 to 4 hours to remove such content on their platforms. And finally, I think the world is moving on towards dedicated legislations on fake news, on cybersecurity law, but the bigger ultimate question will be, howsoever brilliant laws you have, if you are not going to effectively enforce them, the entire menace of fake news will continue to stare us even more rapidly in the coming times.
Now you left 5 seconds for both of them. Please go ahead.
So the Snowden revelations as data journalists taught us something hugely valuable in this particular debate. There are two key lessons that I want to leave here that, again, are different to what everybody's saying. That Gen Z would have me say, and I know lots of them on the live stream are listening, if you do something in my name, which our cyber industry does, which arguably some of it's called surveillance, and the nation states and the things that you mentioned, Stefan. If you do something in my name, don't just consult me, I must be involved. And number two, this whole debate, what they say about it is don't be creepy. This is creepy, and therefore they don't subscribe to it. So I think we need to inform a new approach from our cybersecurity industry by bringing these folks on board, getting them involved, and using that community and social movement piece to actually take a different approach, because nation states that are hostile to our ambitions have no access to that, and they have no intention to do it. So that's my view.
I can disagree violently, that's fun. So, I think the important point here is, of course, that fake news and influence operations is nothing new. It existed long before the internet, and it's going to jump onto any new platform. It doesn't matter if it's text or video or Snapchat or whatever. I mean, actors who want to influence everything from destiny of corporations to nations will continue to spread these kinds of things. And again, it's a power race. I think, we have, on the good side, as we presume we are, we'll have to continue to develop methods and tools to fight this. And of course, it's challenging, just like you pointed out, because this is really in the balance here of being able to protect against these things while still preserving freedom of speech. Very, very tricky, a real minefield, of course. So, as someone else said in the previous panel, we won't be out of a job anytime soon.
Okay, so thank you. I don't know if we have enough time to question and answer. No? Good. So I please give the hands to the distinguished speakers.